Hi, good evening, everyone. Santosh Kumar. I welcome you all to our uh, our session on Mezzaterra, fragments from the common ground. This is a concept which was propagated by Adaf Sofi, who envisions Mezzaterra as a common ground, where a kind of melting point, meeting point, or a middle ground, an area of that overlap, a space where culture, languages, and people from varying social political backgrounds, ideological and identity positions, and belief systems come together to shade each other, inspire, and create depth and perspective. Taking inspiration from this vision of a space for polyphonic conversation, the Department of English, Cultural and History Studies at Christ Deemed to be University, Bannerghatta Road campus, we present to you Mezzaterra, the series of talk and discussion. Adhering to Sophie's terms in letter and spirit, our webinar aims to be a common meeting ground, not just for people, but for ideas in creative flux, to be reimagined, reshaped, and redeployed in the face of changing realities that are emerging and will continue to emerge as we find ourselves in an unprecedented moment and unfamiliar landscape. This weekly series is not limited by constraint of themes and spaces. A common belief in the need for an open conversation weaves the talk together across disciplinary boundaries. Coincidentally, today is also a day of World Translation Day, and this is a day which is an opportunity to thank the language professionals and literary translators who try to bring or bridge the gaps in the world together. And on this occasion, we have with us our speaker this week, who is a translator, literary critic, and a poet, Dr. Anisur Rahman, who was formerly a professor of English at Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi. He is currently senior advisor to one of the prominent platform for Urdu literary tradition, that is Rekta Foundation, the world's largest website on Urdu language, literature, and culture, and which hosts Rekta annual celebration. He has worked and published in the areas of comparative literature, translation, and post-colonial and Urdu studies. He has authored 4 books and edited 6 volumes, and produced English translation of 2 collections of Urdu poetry. Some of them include Earthenware, 60 poems, in translations, Positions and Paradigm, Hajaro Khwaishe Aisi, the wonderful world of Urdu ghazals, and the socio-literary cultures of South Asia. A collection of his Urdu poetry in English translation titled The Garden of All Senses, 5 countries of West Urdu poetry, is going to be published into 2020. That will be in coming this. He has also been a Shastri Fellow at the University of Alberta, Canada, and a visiting scholar to Purdue University, USA, in 2017. Today, Professor Rahman is going to talk on Is Goddess a Petty Girl? The Poetics and Politics of Translation, which is a reflection on his own process of translator of poetry from Urdu to English and vice versa, through which he explores some of the key facets and challenges of translation. His talk will discuss some questions that engage his attention as a translator, especially the problematics of the author, text, translator, and the reader. And he explores how it leads him to define the problem of translatability. In this process, he foregrounds his understanding of translations as a mode of developing a dialogue and discourse at multiple level, and a challenge that come with it. Invoking W.V. Yeats' parallelism of a goddess or a pretty girl, he will attempt to explore how translators can possibly negotiate with the poetics and politics of translator. With this word, I would like to welcome Professor Anisur Rahman to on behalf of Christ University, and I will hand over the mic to platform to him. Sir, over to you. Before, sir, just one announcement. I would request the audience to keep your mute your mic mute, and if you have some questions, some comments, keep it for the end of the session. Professor Anisur Rahman will speak for, let's say, 50 minutes or 60 minutes, and then half an hour we will have for question and answer. So with that note, I would hand over the platform to Professor Anisur Rahman. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for your very kind words and your kind invitation and for your kind introduction. First of all, I must thank you, Santosh Kumar ji, and I can see in the audience quite a few names that I can very clearly recognize, though some of the faces I cannot see. But thanks everyone for being here so that we can converse, so that we can meet here at least virtually, and we can develop some kind of a dialogue today. Thanks to Christ University, thanks to the Department of English, Cultural Studies, History for inviting me to this on this occasion, which is incidentally and fortunately the Translation Day, International Translation Day. Therefore, this is the most opportune moment for me, and I consider myself to be very lucky to be speaking on this day when the world is celebrating translation. We all know that translation is one of the major engagements, and therefore talking of translation in today's world and today here at Christ University platform is something very, very fortunate and something very, very, I would consider myself to be fortunate, and I think that this is the day when we should be talking about translation, broadly speaking. I also thank my old student, Renu Elizabeth Abraham, who studied in the university where I taught, and that is Jamia. And I also met her and the colleagues in the Department of English, History, and other departments when I visited your university about 2-3 years ago. And I was very happy meeting your students and the kind of seminar that you had organized there in collaboration with lots of people who were there. So that was one and the first introduction of mine with your university. And I consider this to be an opportune moment for me to be here once again and to be able to converse with you. When I heard about this Mezzaterra conversations for the first time, I read about it, and there was a small write-up, a brief write-up about this. And I felt that this was a wonderful platform to be able to meet friends, to throw ideas open, and to discuss issues, to discuss something that bothers us, something that interests us. So when Renu Elizabeth phoned me, and I immediately agreed because of some personal reasons and also for the academic reasons, which are very clearly understandable. After these words, let me begin by invoking the title. Let us remind ourselves of the title which I proposed for this seminar, for this webinar, and for this talk, I should say better. So when we were discussing about the title and about the area that I should be speaking on, this idea came to my mind, this title came to my mind. Though some of the participants who are here told me when it was on the Facebook and other places that it is quite an intriguing title. Well, it is an intriguing title, I must say, and I must confess. But I think this is how I would like to begin, by referring to, or by invoking, I would say, W.B. Yeats. In fact, I'm going to talk of 3 persons here to begin with, that is W.B. Yeats and Dorothy Wellesley. They were great friends. Dorothy Wellesley was W.B. Yeats's very close friend. She was a minor poet, not much of a name, so to say, but a great friend of W.B. Yeats. And he has written letters to Dorothy Wellesley. So I would begin by reading a few lines, 3-4 lines from the letter that W.B. Yeats wrote to Dorothy Wellesley. And this is a letter in which he talks about a translation that was in the process. And this translation was of the Upanishads. And this was being done by Swami Purohit Swami of Maharashtra. And in this letter dated 21st of December, 1935, W.B. Yeats writes, and I read it from there. I helped Purohit Swami to translate the Upanishads. He says, I helped him to translate the Upanishads. It is amusing to see his delightful astonishment when he discovers that he can call a goddess this handsome girl, or even a pretty girl. This is from where I have taken my title. So he says, it's amusing to see his delighted astonishment when he discovers that he can call a goddess this handsome girl, or even a pretty girl, instead of a maiden of surpassing loveliness. Then he says, I say to him, think like a wise man, but express yourself like the common people. And the result is that he will make the first great translation of the Upanishads. Just 5 lines are here, but these are so very significant lines that tell us lots about the process of translation, how a collaboration in translation takes place, how W.B. Yeats, such a major poet of his times, as it is said that the last romantic and the first modernist is taking interest in a text that is ours, and how he's trying to help a Purohit Swami, and how he is expecting that a wonderful text is going to be in hand soon enough. This was published later, and by Faber and Faber in 1938, and this is a letter that he wrote in 1935. That is when this process of translation has already taken place. I would draw your attention to some of these words he uses. That he says the pretty girl, and he says that this is what Swami does, Purohit Swami does. But he himself says that it could have been a maiden of surprising loveliness. Now, we should question ourselves whether, as a students of translation studies, we should question ourselves here, whether there is any need, if at all, there is any need to translate a goddess. A goddess, these days, as you see, in translation, those were the days when you were very unsure about your words, and therefore you glossed over those words and you translated, brought it something very close to that, and to that image, to meet that image through your words, through vulgar explanations or through vulgar equivalents. So at that point of time, that is what being done in the 40s, or even before that, or even 50s. But later, we developed an idea that there is no need to gloss over such things. Let goddess be goddess. So if someone is going to translate it today, he would not say a pretty girl or a handsome girl or a girl or a maiden of surprising loveliness. He would not use probably. But remember, in the 30s and the 40s, as things were, translation studies were taking its root, and in a very big way in India. So lots of things had to be explained. And in the process of explaining, many of the things got mixed up. So what you got, the reader what ultimately got was something that was not the real picture of what one was trying to understand, or even what the reader, the original writer, the first creative writer who wrote in a particular language was trying to say, but the translator was not able to pick up in the manner that he was probably trying to convey to the reader. So this is an important question that W.B. Yeats raises, and then he finally says that this is how I'm helping him, and he will probably come up with a wonderful translation of the Upanishads in due course of time, and that happened. Now this book is extinct. You can't find a copy of this book. This is no longer available. It has gone out of print. And as I said, Dorothy was a minor poet, not such a major figure either as a critic or as a literary, but a great friend. So this is something very in say a conversation which is in an informal way being done between these two. And Purohit Swami died in 1941, and the book was very much popular there, in demand there. But later, it was forgotten. So no one remembers this book any longer. So interestingly, which on the title page, I will draw the attention to the title page of this translation of this book. It says there, put into English by Purohit Swami and W.B. Yeats. It does not say translated into English by Purohit Swami and W.B. Yeats. Now, this is another difference. This is the time lag. You can see that now you do not say, and you do not put on the cover page of any book that put into English by so and so. But this book, published by Faber and Faber in 1938, says put into English. It has been put into English. It doesn't say translated into English by W.B. Yeats. It doesn't say translate by Purohit Swami. So this is one interesting point that I wanted to make, that there is some amount of confidence that we have gained now. And the confidence has come in two ways. One is that you put your name there as a translator. You don't any longer say rendered into or put into. So what is this? This is the kind of confidence that you have gained. Second point is this, that we do not any longer translate each and everything but we keep those things without any explanation, and we keep it in italics as they were. For example, you will not translate a goddess as a pretty girl or a handsome girl or bring any kind of an adjective. You just a girl, you just say a goddess, a goddess, a god, a god. So this is another example of how translation has gained ground and how people have got into it and tried to open the areas, try to explore newer areas, and try to acclimatize others, the readers, from other sources, from other languages, from other cultural heritages, from other literary cultures, so that they also have to make an effort. I'm reminded here, suddenly I'm reminded of one Canadian poet, and because Canadian literature was trying to make its place and people were again and again asking or questioning its authenticity. Most of these post-colonial sites, people were trying to understand what this site is like, this literary site. Is there any literary culture? So this major poet, once again, this Canadian poet says, I have told you my name several times. I will not tell you once again. Discover who I am. This is the kind of a situation. A translator is so confident now, he doesn't say put into English or in the Hindi or Urdu or any language. It is a translation. You do not explain, you don't gloss over anything any further, but you come up with greater confidence. So there is a certain methodology which has come into being. Something about methodology that has come. It raises certain very important questions for us about the structuring of the text itself. How do you structure the text? And how do you identify the context of the text that it carries? And then the possible emergence of a credo. So that particular, those 4-5 lines from that letter which I have drawn upon, give me an idea to think about the credo that was emerging and that had started emerging. And from that, from 50s onwards, during the past 50s onwards, 6-7 decades, it has gained ground in a very significant manner. So we talk of translation today, and today especially on the international translation, with greater confidence than we did earlier. So this is one thing which is very important. Looking beyond Yeats and Purohit Swami and Dorothy Wellesley, to whom I have referred, translation today has turned out to be a much more serious engagement than it was ever. So in 2020, translation is a major engagement. Students of literature who are listening to me, a student of English literature or any other literature, so to say, some of the major areas that we study today, one of the major areas that you have is translation studies. This is a comparative, post-colonial theory. So translation forms a major part of your curriculum today. And therefore, what I'm trying to put forward before you, that looking beyond Purohit Swami, W.B. Yeats, and Dorothy Wellesley, translation has turned out to be a much more serious engagement now than it was ever before. With whom? It is an engagement, serious engagement with authors who are creating their text, the original text, the source text in a particular language, because they have an eye on a translator who might take that book into hand and develop into a translated text. So it's an engagement for the authors. It is an engagement, major engagement for the translators. Interestingly, it's a major engagement for the readers, I and you who read the translation, who try to approach it and try to see the two texts together and try to look at it critically. It has also brought us very close to the theoretical perspective that has been developed on account of the development that has taken place in translation studies. So now the author, the translator, the reader, and the theoretician have joined hands together. So we are living in a very a moment which is full of excitement. These four have joined hands together: the author, the translator, the reader, and the theoretician, and who all together make it into a serious academic engagement. And that is why we are talking today of what this whole business about translation is. Now, there is if I take you back to title once again, the subtitle of this presentation is Poetics and Politics of Translation. So when I say politics of translation, politics is one of the words which has been used very frequently in the recent past. Most often, students of literature use these words very frequently, especially students of post-colonial literature, because they see lots of politics in the formulations that have critical formulations that have gone into it, and also in the writing of the text. So there is lots of politics involved. Therefore, politics has been very favorable, is a very favorite term that has been used by academicians, by students all over, I would say, the post-colonial studies more especially. So what does politics mean when I talk of politics in terms of, or in relation to translation? What I mean by this, that it aims to disseminate. So translation is an aim. So you have an aim, you have a certain politics behind the aim that you have before you. And what is this? You want to disseminate. And what you want to disseminate is a matter of your political control. You want to control that, and therefore you want to send across, you want to disseminate a particular text, and you choose a particular text. So choice is a matter of politics. Then you mold your taste of the readers. You are molding the taste of the reader. You're trying to incorporate them or their taste into, and trying to bring the two tastes together, so to say. So there is a politics. The choice of the author that you make is a matter of politics. You choose one, you don't choose another. So there is a politics involved in why you choose a particular author. There is a politics in the way you choose a text, and you don't choose another text. So the choice you make of an author, in the choice that you make of a text, in the choice that you make of a genre, for example, is also a matter of politics. The choice that you make in what target language you are choosing to translate, and what source language you have chosen to draw upon. So these are all matters of politics, the target reader and the reader in the original language. Ultimately, translation is also a matter of representation. We say that literature is representation, and representation is another word which has been used very widely, especially during these 30 years or 40 years. Ever since post-colonial studies opened its wings, and it flew like this. So these two words are very significant, the politics and representation. So what do we mean by representation? Not for others, but for the students, I will just share in one word. So literature is purely representation. Means that you imaginatively reconstruct the realities, not as it is, but there is an imaginative blending into the facts that you are, or into the issues, or into the ideas that you come across, and you find to develop a perspective, a certain kind of a perspective. So you represent that, you do not present that. By representation, we mean there is an imaginative reconstruction. So when you choose a particular text, you represent that text. You try to create certain amount of, amount of credibility to that text for the target reader, who is there in your mind all the time, with whom you want to converse when the book comes into print. So lots of politics is involved into it. We'll not go into the details of it. We all know about what I'm trying to hint at. But a few things that later I will talk about will also give you some idea of politics. Then the second word which I have used in my title is poetics. Now, what does poetics? We all know it relates with style, it relates with theory, it relates with principles, it relates with the theory of translation, basically. So when you talk of the poetics and the practice of and the politics of translation, we have in mind the choices that we are making, and the way we are making that choice, the way we are making to execute the work that we have on hand. So this is what is broadly that engages our attention as students of literature and as students of translation and translation of translated text. We also need to know, therefore, how to introduce a text in translation. Translation is a much more complicated thing than it generally appears to be. Some people say it's such an easy thing. It's very gullible to say so. Translation makes very heavy demands upon the reader, upon the translators. It's a serious engagement. You have to decide on how you want to introduce a particular author or a text, how to disseminate that text, how to think about its acceptability, how to supplement it, and how to finally make a place for its evaluation, how to get it printed, how to get it reviewed, how to reach out. So many questions are there involved. Therefore, just thinking that I will sit with a book in my hand or in my table and I'll pull a chair, take a thesaurus and take a dictionary and translate is not enough. I would rather go to the extent of saying that taking a text and translating it and sending it to a publisher is not enough. You have to develop a whole, say, climate of opinion to be able to create a condition in translation for the acceptability of translation. For example, if you do random translations, they also make some contribution at some point in one way or the other. But a translation has to be a much more planned activity. You have to reach to a reader who doesn't know that language, doesn't know that literary culture, doesn't know that literature at all, and he has to be acclimatized to that, brought close to that. Therefore, there is lots of planning involved. So it is not a matter of sitting on that, pulling a chair and taking your thesaurus and your dictionary and taking a text and doing it. It's very unimaginably. You have to do very thoughtfully. So this is one thing which say supplementing, for example. You have to supplement your translation. You just can't translate and send it across for publication. You have to supplement. You have to write about which text, why, what are the other correlates that the text makes, that it accounts for. What does the text represent to you, and what is going to be represented in a language, the target language which we have chosen. So lots of preparation. So suppose if you are taking a novelist or a poet into account and going to translate, so you have to introduce that poet or a novelist. You have to write a preface. You have to write an introduction. You have to write proper kinds of evaluations for that, get proper kinds of evaluation for that once it is published. So it is not just a matter of translating and sending across for publication, but to think a little more quietly and to develop or to create a condition for the acceptability. So a translator's job is not just to hold a pen or to be sitting before the computer and doing it verbally and sending it across. Lots of things are involved in the process of translation, and that is what is going to, and that is what is happening now. That is why translation has become a major point of concern today, and is gaining acceptability day after day. Now, let me tell you one very brief idea. This is how I started many years ago, 3-4 decades ago, when I showed my interest in translation. One idea came to my mind, and at that point of time, I was thinking there is something that has really engaged my attention, and I thought that every expression that you make, verbal expression or gestural expression, every expression is a kind of a translation. Even the animals, even the sounds of the animals, the barking of a dog or the neighing of, so anything that happens, the chirping of a bird, there is a translation of something which is there in the mind of that bird or the animal. Similarly, when I speak out to you in a particular language, there is a thought which I'm trying to translate. So that thought is itself a translation, which I call the primary translation. But this primary translation is the work that you have created for yourself, which you call a text, a literary text, which you call a text in a certain language. Now, if I send it out to you, and you read it and you think this is a text which is worthy of translation, and you choose to translate that text, then your work will be a secondary translation. So this was a kind of a theoretical concept that came into my mind when I started translating and thinking about this whole process about 4 decades ago. So I thought that writing, the first writing, the primary writing, which I call the primary translation, which is the primary text, I called it the primary translation, which is the creative work, the original work. And when it was going for translation, I called it the secondary translation. Now, in this process of the secondary and the primary translation, lots of things also come into account that we have to take care of. It's a very curious, who is the translator there? But translator is a very curious human being. He is a link between the author and the reader and the translated text. He builds a bridge between two persons, himself and the person who had created that text for him for the first time. He also becomes a bridge between himself and the reader. So there are 3 persons who come into being: the writer, the original writer in the source text, he himself in the target text, and the reader whom he is looking at. So there are 3 persons: the reader, the writer, that is the author, the reader, and the text that he creates. So there is a very interesting interrelationship between the text, the reader, and the creator about this. So this existence, he's a perennially existence creature. He has been there for ages, since eternity. He has been, this translator has been available all the time. The primary translator and the secondary translator has been in all the world languages. If you look at the history of translation, you will find that this process has been there for ages. There is multiple layers of relationship between these 3 that you will see. They create community of readers, different communities of readers they create. They create different belongs of messages, you can say, packs and packs of messages that they create. Clusters of languages come together, and therefore this translator raises certain questions. Now, who is this translator? Therefore, you can ask and you can see that who is this translator? Is this translator an author also? Well, he is an author, but he's a secondary author, as I would say. As just I was saying, the primary text and the secondary text. So if I were to answer, I would say that yes, the translator is also an author, but he's the secondary author of the text. Then you can say, does he need to know the translation theory as well to be able to translate? My answer would be no, not as such, because there are certain things which of course help you understand the parameters, the way of how to look at it. Techniques, therefore, but it is not necessary that one who is trained particularly in translation theory or into the arts and the poetics of it will only be able to translate, which is not the reality. Anyone can pick up, but of course the critical sense is all the time alive, which applies to the poets as well. All poets have not read books on poetry, on the theory of poetry, but they know which word to choose and which word not to choose. So when I often use this sentence in this line in a classroom, beholder single in the field, yon solitary high. This is a very well-known poem, solitary. So why does Wordsworth use this word behold? Or why does any poet for that matter use a particular word for a particular situation? For behold, there was another word available to Wordsworth: see, look, behold, observe, watch, and so many other words for it. But he uses one word. Similarly, each poet, each writer, each translator uses a particular word, and there is behind that, there is a way of looking at the text and way of looking at that word, the baggage that this word contains and how this word is going to make sense and to communicate to the target reader. So I would say that he doesn't need to know any translation theory or such, but there is an inbuilt theory into the persona, into the mind, into the being of the translator, who himself knows which word to translate and how. Maybe he does not literally translate. He finds something much more interesting. But sometimes when he becomes too creative, he comes and stands behind the creative writer himself and tries to take his persona and becomes the creative. So this is the problem with the creative translation or with the free translations, that the translator does not bridges the gap between himself and the creative writer and the first writer, the original writer, the text, the work created in a particular language. So he faces that and he becomes the author. So that is a very dangerous ground to be, slippery ground actually to be on, when you assume someone else's persona and you try to become the reader. So the translator has to have some control over that. Now you can also ask is, what is the motivation to do what he does? And what method does he apply? This is a matter of politics. So what he chooses and in what manner he is going to choose. So the translator therefore has to be a theoretician in this manner, even while he is not a theoretician, so to say, and in the plain and proper terms. You can also say, does he also vie with the other authors to project his own discourse? Yes and no, both. He has a reader in mind. And with that reader in mind, he has that author in mind, and is very conscious of the author and the reader, and therefore his strategy and his planning and his execution is all the time. So the translator all the time is under the pressure of all these questions that he has to face and he has to answer for himself. Does he really create a community of compatible readers? Yes, he does. He tries to create a community of compatible readers, compatible with himself, with the language in which he's translating. So he tries to understand that compatibility and how that compatibility can be achieved by evolving certain strategies to be able to translate in a manner which becomes acceptable. And finally, he's creating a democracy of sorts, a democracy of commons, you could say, a very hegemonic kind of a democracy in which he wants to live. He wants to project a certain ideology and certain idealism. Of course, maybe that he projects certain ideology and certain ideology, certain idealism and ideology. But all these things are a part and parcel of the makeup of the translator, who tries to find his own moorings and who tries to find his own route to be able to arrive. So just as the writer in the original language, that is the primary translator, was trying to arrive at a certain place, the translator too tries to arrive at a certain place. Having said that, who is empowered in this whole process? I look at it, in my book, which I published recently in translation, I try to evolve this kind of a theory that there are 4 ways in which a text or the translator or the reader is evolving. At one place, the writer is important. He is the empowered person. The author is important. The author, because he creates a text which creates a reader which creates a translator. So here the prime importance is of the reader, who is the first person who creates. But when the text becomes important, so the text takes you to the reader, to the author, sorry. The text takes you to in the second paradigm, so to say. So let me repeat. In the first paradigm, the author is important because the author is empowering himself. He takes you to a text. The text takes you to a reader. The reader goes to the translator for coming into another language. In the second paradigm, the second model which I evolved is this: that you have the text which appeals to you. You do not worry much about the author. And this text then takes you to the author, who is the person who has written this. Then he goes to the translator and finally to the reader. So this is the text is empowered here. In the third model or the third paradigm which I evolved is this, that the translator becomes very important because it brings a new, completely fresh atmosphere, a fresh wind he brings to you. You start breathing in a different manner. You feel so very refreshed. So this translator brings you a text. And through this text, you go to the reader, to the author who had created it for the first time. Then you go to the text, and then you go to the reader. So here the translator is empowered. And finally, there is a mix of the two, that the reader, the author, the text, and the translator all merge into one. So there are various ways of empowerment. So in the first model, which I proposed, is this, that the author is empowered. In the second model, you see that the text is empowered. In the third model, you see that the translator is empowered. And in the fourth model, you see that the reader is empowered. And this reader also goes hears back and forth to the reader, to the creator, the original creator, and the translator. And then he also develops a dialogue with the possible readers who will be reading it after the book is published. So it's a very complex and a very interesting kind of phenomenon that we are engaging with. I'm not talking of very plain theory as theory in the sense that these are my personal experiences of how I try to evolve my own ways through the text in a particular language, and in a target language I try to negotiate. This is what I personally thought about the whole business of translating and whole business about relating with the text and to be able to bring it to a reader, which an alien reader. And I will talk about my works later so that you can understand what I'm trying to hint at. Writing, therefore, is putting words or language in a certain order. But translation is revising that order. Translation is the changing that order. So a language that a translator, that a reader, that the original writer, the creative writer, the first-hand writer, he uses a word in a certain order. There is a certain syntax which he has in mind, certain grammar which he has in mind, and he tries to indigenize it, of course, from the same language in which he's writing. But what the translator does, he goes into the target language, and what he does, that he changes the patterns and the structures. Might be the ideas also altered here and there. So when it goes into the hands of the translator, it doesn't remain so literally straight and plain. So that what I'm trying to suggest is this, that writing is putting a language in an order. Translation is altering that order or changing that order. Not time enough to explore that further, but you can understand that when it goes in the hands of the translator takes the text afresh and rewrites that text according to his own syntax, according to his own grammar, according to his own pattern of thought, and he tries to indigenize in the language which is his target language. These pieces of writing, that order is it's a part of the whole human consciousness right from the very beginning, how it all started, the process of writing, and how in the process of writing through the ages and through history right from the very beginning, because you know that when the message comes out for the first time, it has one bearing, but when it passes from hand to hand, from mouth to mouth, the message keeps on changing. Similarly, the translator, the message that he tries to bring also keeps on changing from time to time and place to place. Therefore, the translator changes that order and therefore comes up with a text which, of course, we need to negotiate, and sometimes we falter while negotiating because maybe the negotiation is not all the time complete. This brings before us the question of translatability. Translatability is a major question for every translator. All of us, or few who are engaging with translation, would understand that translatability is one of the major questions. You have to examine the ways the language behaves with you, or behaves with itself, or its indigenous readers, how you treat it in the process of writing, the stages of rewriting, the stages of translating one message into another. So multiple domains of human knowledge and human communication comes into being. So this is the process. Translatability finally is the kind of a negotiation that takes place between language and intent. So the translator has to weigh and balance the language and in that particular language, how a particular intent has been incorporated. There is a difficulty sometimes in going to that intent. Or if you use an old word, meaning, because meaning these days is very much in question. Is there any meaning in the text? If at all there is any meaning in the text, we wonder. Theory says there is nothing like that. There is no meaning as such. You can approximate to that. You can go somehow, get a sense, an idea. To the structuralists and the post-structuralists and the deconstruction, and the whole theory is based upon the idea. So if you go back to the 60s and the 70s, William I.A. Richards and William Ibsen, they were looking after meaning and the meaning of meaning and the meaning of ambiguity and the 7 types of ambiguity, and so much from complexity in the way of how the text is created and how it reaches from one. So it might have so many readers, responses from the readers that come. So translatively is majorly a matter of engaging with the language and the intent that it has, possibly the intent that it carries that we are not sure about. Translatability is also the second important point to me, is the sound and the relationship of the sound with the meaning. Otherwise, the meaning and the possibility of its having a sound within itself. Every word has a sound unto itself, and that sound also is a part of the meaning of that word. Therefore, a translator has to weigh and balance that word so far as its audible value, the auditory value of that. That is why you think of auditory imagination when Eliot was talking of auditory imagination. So you think of the verbal meaning is one thing, but the auditory meaning is yet another thing which so these are the questions which a translator has to engage with. So the question of translatability is a very important question. Sound and meaning, language and intent. Then, how does he engage with the form and the structure? And finally, what does he do with the culture, the history and the politics? So for example, in a while, as you said, that I'll be drawing upon my own work. So when I talk about how I did my ghazal translations and how I did my poetry translations, otherwise Nazm translation, I'll tell you briefly about how I did it and how I try to negotiate with culture and with history and with politics and with form and structure and sound and meaning and language and intent. These are the tall orders. I'm not trying to scare anyone to be that you don't try your hand on translation. Do. It is a wonderful thing to do. It's so very fulfilling. But these are the demands that the translation makes upon you, and you have to be very conscious about these demands, and you have to negotiate with those demands. So every because it relates with the kind of text you have. Every text, has a pre-life, has a life, and then there is afterlife. I evolved it in this manner. I wrote about it in this manner, that a text has a prenatal life, has a natal life, and a postnatal life. So when a text is in the state of formation, it is the prenatal stage. When it comes into being, it is the natal stage. And when it finally comes out and goes into your hands, it is the postnatal stage. That is the pre-life, the life, and the afterlife of the text. So there are cycles about this. So when you translate, when you write for the first time, you pass through the same stages. You have a text which is there in the head. It is in the womb itself, so to say. Then it comes out and it has a life. And then finally it goes out and reaches the hands of a translator. It's post-natal. So it has a pre-life. It has a pre-life, it has a life, and it has a post-life. It goes on. So it is an afterlife. So the same process is repeated in the hands of the translator as well. The translator picks up a book. So there is a pre-life that the book has he conceives here in the head. There is a womb. The womb that this translator carries, in that womb he puts that text and tries to conceive it afresh for himself in his own language. So that is the pre-life of the text. Then he translates, gives a life to the text. And finally, after that, after publication, it gets an afterlife, and then it stays with you. It happens that after a while, you look at your own translations, you feel very unhappy about certain expression that you used. And you thought that this is something which I shouldn't have done. And this word, this phrase, this method would have probably suited it better. Because, and that is why it is said that you do not translate finally. You always leave it, abandon it, because there's a sense of finality which must arrive, that this is it, and beyond this, I cannot probably touch it any further. Therefore, you stop doing it. And that is the word used for this, that you abandon the whole exercise. This far and no further. And therefore, you put a stop. But unfortunately, after a few years, when you look at your own work, you feel, well, I could have done it far better than what I had done 2 years or 3 years or 5 years ago. So these are the questions that the reader, the translator, the audience, or the target reader in both the languages are required to negotiate with. Writing and translation are the acts of developing a dialogue. There is a dialogue that one develops with the reader, and the whole lot of say the literary culture that evolves comes with it. Very briefly, I'll be touching upon it so that I can have some more points to add about my own work, which you probably mentioned that I should be doing. So both the authors and the translator, first, what do? They develop a dialogue with themselves. Translation is a process of developing a dialogue. I consider it a dialogue. You develop a discourse. So you develop a dialogue at several layers, with several persons, with the language, with the form. You develop a dialogue with two literary cultures. You develop a dialogue with the text that is created. You develop a dialogue in the text that is being created for another reader. Then there's a third level of dialogue development, which is with the fellow readers, with fellow writers. With the fellow writers also, you develop a dialogue. With the expected readers, with the possible readers, the potential readers, you develop a dialogue how they are going to take it when it is published. So the possible reader, with the possible readers, which are invisible reader, you develop a dialogue with that. So this dialogue that you develop, or this conversation that you develop, or this collaboration that you develop takes place at self. So the first collaboration is with your own self. You collaborate with your own self. You try to understand that text again for your own self, first for your own self. Then you try to negotiate or to collaborate or to shake hands with the author who was trying to write it who wrote it for the first time. Then you negotiate with that culture, with the language, with that form, with that genre. You develop a dialogue with it, the whole literary history and culture. Finally, you think of that possible reader who is going to lay his hands upon, her hands upon, and then finally how she or he is going to take it up. So the dialogue is it's multiple level dialogue development takes place, and therefore I would once again say that it is not an easy process as some people think that one can pick a dictionary and take a thesaurus and sit across and then do something and will come up with flying colors. That is not it. When Swami was doing that translation, when W.B. Yeats was helping him out, probably these were the issues involved, because there was a collaboration that was. So there is another kind of a collaboration that was developing between Swami and W.B. Yeats, and what he writes about to his friend Dorothy Wellesley and how he was trying to help. And he writes about the process in which. So the problem of translatability is there. I will just give you one example of this translatability issue. Umar Khayyam's Rubaiyat are very world famous. Everyone has read it. But if you look at the Persian text, and you will find that the English text is far removed from the original text. It's wonderful compositions that Fitzgerald has brought to us. Umar Khayyam's philosophy and the way he looked at life and the wine and the kind of a happy-go-lucky kind of a fellow, and this tavern was the universe. Well, of course, Fitzgerald does that. But there's a big gap between the two translations, to the extent that people forgot about Umar Khayyam and took Fitzgerald as the real poet, because it was such an appealing thing. So he must have revised, and he has revised, because he has brought very close to the culture to which he belonged himself, and to which his readers were going to address. And that is how he picked up on Persian text, Khayyam's text, but he made it his own text. So the question of how far can a translator travel, and where does he want to arrive, of course, he tried to negotiate with that. So in the process, what it became, that it became a much more popular text in English than it was probably in Persian. Only those who read it in Persian would know what it means, but the English readers completely, wholly, solely, blindly follow what Fitzgerald has come forth with. So that is what the case of Rubaiyat. I'll give you two more examples. Maybe I can pick the case of Premchand. Premchand is a very interesting case to translate. And why I'm saying so, you see, Premchand was writing in two languages. And he wrote in two languages, and he was aware of two literary cultures. Actually, he was aware more of other literary cultures. He was also aware of the Persian literary culture. But he wrote in, mostly Premchand wrote in Urdu. This is a different matter that Premchand, wherever you read, he's always presented as Hindi short story writer and novelist or fiction writer, which is not the case. Premchand wrote mostly in Urdu, essentially in Urdu, first and last in Urdu. He wrote some stories in Hindi, but he has been projected. I'm not falling into that controversy. I'm not talking about that at all. But what, as a translator, you as a translator, me as a translator, I'm trying to think of what Premchand was trying to do in which language. So he was writing in two languages. These two languages had very different shades of meaning, has very different shades of appeal to the readers. He makes lots of changes. For example, some of his stories end at one particular place in Hindi, but it goes for two more paragraphs in Urdu. He changes the name of his characters from one story to another. So in the Urdu stories, there are Muslim names. In Hindi story, there are Hindu names. Then you have dissimilar titles. In Hindi, there is one name. In Urdu, there is another name, another title for that story. Then there are some sections are dropped, some sections are added. The problem, therefore, is how do you determine a Premchand text? How do you say that this is the Premchand text which I'm going? So this is a major issue which every translator, lots of people have edited, lots of people have engaged with these ideas, and translations of Premchand have also come forward. But you never know how far this translation, which has been done from one language, either Urdu or Hindi, because you never know, because what happened that he wrote his stories in Urdu and gave it to someone to translate. Now, if you look at his Hindi text, you will find that the language of all the Hindi stories is not one. There's huge variation in the language. Some are very plain, some are very Sanskritized. Some people who knew Hindi and Urdu both just put it the midway and chose a language which is easy to translate, easy to communicate, neither Persianized nor Sanskritized, very simple day-to-day dialogic language. So Premchand is a difficult. So you have to develop a policy. You have to finally evolve a policy, and then you have to write about the policy that you evolve, because Premchand is a different kind of an author. So when you engage with that, when you negotiate with this author, you will have to understand how this author you have been able to draw upon, how you have been to engage or negotiate with this particular kind of an author who has not written one text, he has written many texts. And he has grown from one stage to another as a writer in a very different perspective from 1907 to 1936, 29 years of career and lots of variations in the career as far as writing is concerned. So if you are translating a author like Premchand, and if you try to engage with Premchand in relation to the prose writings that he has brought forth, you will see that negotiating with Premchand is a very difficult task. It's not easily done. Friends, I will give you another example, and after that I will come to some of my own works from Urdu poetry translation. And this is another very experimental work, very interesting work that I will speak about. This was 1969. Ghalib's death centenary year, 1969. 1869, he passed away. So in 1969, world over, there were celebrations of Ghalib death centenary. In India and everywhere else, people were talking about Ghalib. Lots of conferences, seminars, books, translations were published. Ijaz Ahmad, you know Ijaz Ahmad, that author of In Theory. So he was in US at that point of time, and he asked some of the American poets, "Have you heard of Ghalib?" And most of them said, "No, who this man was." And he explained who this man was. He felt bad about it, that people didn't know Ghalib. Shahid Ali has written at one place, "I felt very bad, very insulted that people didn't know such a major poet in the Western world." So Ijaz Ahmad did a wonderful thing. He talked about 7, 8 American poets that this is Ghalib, this is a centenary year. He was a major poet. He wrote at this point of time, these are his ideas. And there is a one form ghazal in which he is supposed to be a great poet, one of the major poets of the language, one of the greatest poets of the language. So would you try your hand on translating this poet? And 7, 8 poets, one of them was Adrienne Rich herself, major American poet, and Robert Bly and several others were there. Fitzsimmons was there, Mark Strand was there, several poets were there. So he distributed those ghazals to these poets. And then he taught them what this particular sher or this couplet, 2 lines, what do they mean? What's the intention, the possible intention? He explained it to them. And then the translations just started coming in. And you will see that these translations, this was a wonderful experimental work. But if you read those translations, you will wonder if this is Ghalib. You will wonder if this is what ghazal is. You will wonder if this is what a sher is. You will wonder if this is the kind of intention that Ghalib, if at all there is an intention, if this was what he did. Some of them translated a couplet that is a sher of 2 lines into 5 lines. Some of them translated the 2 lines into 1 line. So the form was violated. The idea was helter-skelter. Everything was just drawn apart. It was not in the form or the fashion that a ghazal could be probably translated. But I value that book in this sense because of the reason that it was a great experiment towards telling the people how it could come, how they could negotiate with this form. Therefore, it bore fruit many, many years later. When this major poet who passed so early, had a very short life, Agha Shahid Ali, when he taught the American poets and the English poets and the British and everyone else that how a ghazal may probably be written. He himself faltered at the beginning, but later he wrote those ghazals because there is a certain way of doing a ghazal. So he taught these American and British poets how to write it. And before he died, he completed his book called Ravishing Disunities. More than 100 poets are there, ghazals are there, and they are in the perfect shape and form. Therefore, he taught. That is what I was trying to refer to, how it expands the area of operation. From one language, how it travels to another, and how in this process, the whole form gets transformed from one hand to another, and finally a form comes up, which you try to say that, well, this is something that is going to hold on. So this was another very interesting example, how Premchand can be negotiated, how the tradition of ghazal can be negotiated. So this is how it comes to. I will end up, because I have some 10 minutes or 15 minutes to go, I will just end up by referring to my own work. Friends, I am a bilingual. I write in 2 languages, English and Urdu, both poetry and prose. And translation has been one of my favorite engagements, academic engagement, I will say, and personal engagement, I would say, since very long time. I published many, many years ago, about 30 years ago, a book called Fire and the Rose. This was a translation of modern Urdu poetry starting from 1930s, that is the progressive writers movement onwards to now. I later thought that this could further be developed and I can probably go back right from the beginnings and come to the present times. Similarly, I thought of ghazal also, that this is one of the most popular forms of Urdu language, or one of the most popular forms of any language in the world that you can think of. That ghazal has been very, very popular. So I started thinking in terms of putting a collection of ghazals in English translation. Well, I have taken a very tall order for myself. And Urdu ghazal, has been one of the most popular things. As I said, it is a major repository, cultural repository of great worth, great cultural signifiers are there. And it has had a very long history, starting from 16th century onwards to 20th century and beyond. So the first major in Urdu poets, Quli Qutub Shah, who was the 5th emperor of the Golconda dynasty of Hyderabad. He was the first Urdu poet who wrote in Telugu and wrote in the language that was prevalent then, which was called Rekhta, and then it developed later into Urdu after the 18th century. Late 18th century, this name Urdu was given to it in the late 18th century. So I thought of starting from the beginnings, and I went to Quli Qutub Shah. I told you a while ago, when I began, that you don't have to translate a text and finish and say goodbye. You have to engage with that seriously. So I thought, let me engage with this whole ghazal, the form of ghazal, much more seriously. So I started collecting poets who could be the most representative poets in the Urdu language from beginning to now. And I lay in my hands upon 65 poets. And then from each poet, I selected two ghazals. And then I put together my anthology of the primary text first. Then I started trying my hand on these texts, and then I evolved a certain way of doing it. And then for that, I wrote a long introduction so that a reader who is not aware of this whole tradition of ghazal in English, who is not been, or any of the languages in India, and would be going to read this book into English, should have a clear idea. So translation is not just translating, it is also supplementing. So by writing a long introduction, you supplement that translation. Translation unto itself is not complete unless you tell the reader what this translation actually entails and what it actually stands for, how significant it is, and therefore why you should be reading it. So a long introduction I did. And similarly, I did a long, and not very long, an introduction to each age. And I divided this age in historical perspective in my own way, and I divided into 7 parts. That these are the historical markers. That this is how the journey of ghazal starts from 16th century, goes to 17th to 18th, and then 19th, and then onwards, like that. And on each age, I wrote a paragraph, a page and a half, so that you can have a broader view of what this age represents and who are the major representatives of this age. Then I wrote a page on each of these poets, 65 poets. And then I came to their translation, to their ghazals. So on the one side, you have the left side, you have the Roman, which you can read. And on the other side, right-hand side, you have the translation. So what I was trying to do, and this is what I think was a way of doing it for me, and which succeeded, I think it succeeded pretty well because it got good reviews from this point of view, that a whole ghazal perspective is available to the reader. Starting from a preface in which I lay down the principles, in which after that I go to the introduction, then introduction to the ages, then introduction to the poets, and with each poet the ghazals, which follow in Roman script first and then English translation. So that is why I was trying to identify the periods, and I was trying to. The same methodology I applied for doing my, say, the next book, which is an anthology of Nazm. Nazm, is not ghazal. Ghazal is a 2-line composition. You are very well aware of that. But Nazm is a regular poem. So all students of English know of that poem. But students of English would not know what a ghazal is, because there's nothing like ghazal in any language of the Western world. Nowhere. You don't have anywhere. It comes from Arabic to Persian, and then from Persian it goes to several languages in the world and comes to Urdu. India became a major destination for ghazal. So I thought that ghazal I have finished with. Let me lay my hands upon the Nazm now. Nazm means the poem, a regular poem. So I thought of another book. So the first book which I did was called Hazaro Khwahishein Aisi, The Wonderful World of Ghazals, Urdu Ghazals, which was published by HarperCollins. And during the past 1 year and so, it has got I think it has been pretty well accepted, appreciated, with good reviews coming. So this whole cycle, that's what I was trying to say. So there is a whole program about how you choose, how you pick, how you do, how you disseminate. Then second, I thought that in order to complete this idea, how do I move forward to be able to give a complete view, open a clear window to the reader? So I thought, let me also try my hand upon the Nazm. Nazm is the poem. And I had done 30 years ago, Fire in the Rose. So I thought that Fire in the Rose was an anthology of poetry from progressive writers movement onwards, that is 1930s onwards. Let me go back. So I went back to Quli Qutb Shah. So I started from 16th century onwards, and I followed the same pattern. Here I have about 70 poets, 70 plus. The book is in the process of publication now. And this year end, or maybe early 2021, it will be out. So then I thought of that book, and I called it A Garden of All Senses. Now there I have put again in the chronological order, the same fashion I have tried to develop. And there I have again put a long introduction. Again, I have a long introduction to the age. Again, I have put a short introduction to the poets, and then the poems are organized in that manner. But here the challenge was greater, far greater than that, in the sense that I have tried to lay my hands upon all the forms. So you have regular poems, you have qasida, you have marsiya, you have rubai, you have qasid, everything that you can think. So all forms of Urdu poetry, all genres of Urdu poetry that you can think of. Then I divided it. The question before me was that how do I divide it into sections? So I revised that section here. So for example, if I were to look at chronological order, at the same time I found 2-3 strands of thoughts were going at the same time. So there was a time when nationalist poetry was being written during 47, before 40s and 50s and onwards, and around that time. Then there was a time when modernists were coming on the scene. So I put that section separately. Then I found there was a postmodernist stance also coming forward. Then I found there were women poets who were very powerful. So then I revised this whole plan a little differently here. So it is in chronological order, but these sections represent different strands of thought, different styles, and different movements or different milieux. So this book, which will be forthcoming now, called Garden of All Senses, is a blend of historical plus genre-wise or form-wise plus historically. I have tried to put the movements that have come forward or the milieu that have come forward. So this was a different kind of say plan that I had evolved for that. So I was trying to approximate, when I was doing ghazal, I was trying to approximate that ghazal into English, and I will cut it short by just saying that what kind of a methodology did I evolve for my ghazal book. This is the tip that I'm trying to pass onward to you, sharing my secret, a personal secret, because I want people to follow this, to try their own hands upon it. So ghazal was the most difficult thing to translate. So what I did is this, number A, B, C, D, I will tell you. I counted the syllables. I read the ghazal, the sher in Urdu, and I saw what is the line length? How does it sound? How does it make sense? What is the meter that the poet is trying to follow? There is a strict meter in Urdu ghazal. You can't do without a meter. There is a line length that is a very fixed line length according to the meter. And there is a metrical pattern there. You can't go shape beyond that metrical pattern. You can't go out of it. You have to. So I started negotiating with this by first counting my syllables. So I counted my syllables in both the lines, because there were 2 lines only available to me and wanted to just follow the form that was there already available. 2 lines. It is a 2-line structure. So syllable count was 1. So I counted my syllable. Then these syllables I tried to count and then finally see that there has to be a uniform number of syllables in line 1 and uniform number of syllables in line 2. This gave me certain sense of musicality. And ghazal is, in a major part, it's about musicality. The rhythm, the internal rhythm. There is a musical line that you are composing, which the original poet had done. Some people might not agree with this. They say that you don't have to imitate that, imbibe that. I personally thought there was no fun in translating unless that sound somehow is communicated to the reader. Then he can enjoy what this form is all about. So there is a uniform number of syllables, counting of the syllables and maintaining uniform number of syllables. Then I thought that there should be similar length of words in every line. Suppose if there is a word in which 3 or 4 letters are there, so let there be all short words, or if there is a longer word, let there be longer words, so that there is no jerk from a small word to a big word, from a long word to a short word. So I tried to maintain that similar length of the words was another target. It was, of course, a difficult decision, but then I thought that I'll try, and I think I did succeed in a certain way. Then I introduced punctuation in my lines, which is not a part of the original. In the Urdu ghazal or Urdu writing, you will see that it is it's very glaring. You never use in poetry commas and full stops and semicolons, etc. in Urdu poetry or ghazal especially. But I tried to introduce that in order to be able to break the idea, because I wanted to contain all the ideas. And if without those commas and semicolons, if I could do, I would be doing a bad job. Therefore, I tried to break it not in lines, but through the semicolons and the full and the colons and the semicolons and the commas, etc. In order to be able to maintain the length and also to be able to maintain the ideas that was there infused into one line and the second line. Neutrality of gender was very important. In Urdu ghazal, the gender is neutral. It's the male gender, the lover and the beloved. But in English, this couldn't be possible. Therefore, this discrimination had to be made. The he and she you would find there. The most important and the most difficult part was that in Urdu ghazal or in Persian ghazal, you would see that there is one thing called qafiya and there is another thing called radif. Without going into it, I'll just give you an example. Dil nada tujhe hua kya hai? Aakhir is dard ki dawa kya? So kya hai is radif, which will recur in every couplet. Hua kya hai, dawa kya hai, ada kya hai, liya kya hai, diya kya hai. So hua, diya, liya, kiya, suna, kaha. This is qafiya. I thought it was a very difficult job. It's very, very, very challenging job to imitate or to try to copy and try to formulate a method or a manner through which I can emulate that and maintain qafiya and radif. To the best possible extent, I try to do this, not wholly, because in every ghazal, in 165 poets and 130, 40 So I couldn't do it in all those ghazals, but to a great extent I've been able to manage that as well. The qafiya and the radif both have to. My main interest was, my main intention was to imitate or to create that internal rhythm, because every line has a rhythm about itself, and the rhythm tallies one with the other. So you pass from one line to another line, the same rhythm follows. So I also try to follow the same rhythm from one line to another line. That is how I went through when I was doing to bring, because I have completed an hour, I think. So let me just go back to Purohit Swami and to finish, to be able to bring the discussion to an end, so that we can, my part of the talk to be end, so that when you start discussing and when you try putting questions, we can, of course, come to Purohit Swami, because once again, so let us now go back to Purohit Swami and see. So putting into a language and translating into a language is the thing that we have to keep in mind. We are not putting one word into another word, and we are not putting one context into another. We are evolving a new text, and this new text has to be justified from all the angles that I have tried to put forward. You have to translate, you have to collaborate, you have to engage with the form, with the genre, with the text, with the sound, with the culture, with the literary culture, I mean. So these were the things which were not bothering Yeats probably. But these are the things we are now bothering much more about, because we are much more theoretically conscious about the poetics of ghazal, so to say. We are much more conscious now. Therefore, these are the engagements that we have to have in mind today. We have to create a credo. We have to create a context now. We have to create a credo, which was not the concern of Purohit Swami or W.B. Yeats. He was translating one text. But when we have learned in these all these years, from 40s onwards to now, so then 60, 70 years, what we have learned is that we have to have a kind of a context before us. We have to create a context, and we have to create a credo for that. We have to surely create the question of form, that is what we are going to hand over to the reader. You have to recreate them, and we have to untiringly and unhesitatingly enter into this zone to be able to speak with certain amount of confidence, that how we engage with the language, with the diction, because language and diction are two different things. How do we evolve our language? Diction is selection from language. So how do we select that language for ourselves? How do we negotiate with the symbol and the myth, which is different from the original text, symbol and the myth? So how approximately, and how the process of approximation may take place. So the individual and the communal histories, how they can be brought together, how the varieties of reading can be also negotiated with. So these are the things that we need to take into consideration. We have gone far away from W.B. Yeats's dictum and Purohit Swami's style of translating, and Dorothy Wellesley's the way he shared with her. So these are the questions we have to think about, the texts and the core text now, because every text has a core text, and how we go to that. So this is, as the end note, let me tell you all this. We have to write back actually, and we have to write forth. So back and forth we have to write. We have to evolve a language, an idiom, and a canon, and we have to evolve a credo. And a translation is not creating the other text, but we are creating a text which is a part and parcel of a certain literary culture, of the new textology, if I can use this word. So you have to create a new textology. You have to create a new kind of a definition of a text in translation. So a huge order, a tall order is there before all the translators. So the great cosmopolitan variety of texts that you have today before you. A student of early 20th, 21st century has to negotiate at different levels. And one is now exposed to a huge amount of knowledge, huge amount of resources that we have for knowledge, and the books that we have. So this context and the co-text and the cosmopolitan variety and the curricular cartography, the cartography of literature, the curricular cartography and the literary all these things have to be part and parcel of our makeup in order to be. So we have to debate translation more substantially now. A translation earlier, a few decades ago, was questioned again and again here in Indian translations. Lots of question. Now the publisher is available. Translation is a big hit now. Translation. Say publishers are there who are engaging with this issue. There is a market for translation. So what we need to do is that we need to develop a more substantial way of looking at it. You have to evolve in modern canon for that. You have to strengthen our translation activities much more seriously and much more critically. And this is how we can probably look at the future and think of the way we can negotiate selection of a text, of a genre, of an author, of an age, and of a style. These are the major questions. But behind these questions, there are many more, some of which I have been able to look at from my own angle. I'll be very happy taking your questions, observations, and comments so that we can also learn together, because learning all the time is a process that we do bilaterally, and we often go hand in hand in the pursuit of knowledge. Thank you very much, all of you friends who joined together. I can see many names who are known to me. That gives me lots of confidence to be able to engage with you. Many thanks to Christ Universities and the colleagues and the friends and the students there, and whosoever has joined here. I see a good number are here already. So I would say stop here and would look forward to your interventions and your questions and comments. Thank you very much, friends.
Thank you, Professor Rahman, for this enlightening talk where you took us to not only the poetics and politics of translation, but you also talked very delicately the process of translation. And I think that's a very good site for us to engage ourselves with this process of translation, because this is also a time where you have the translation in the form of, let's say, subtitling a visual text, and which is so popular nowadays. So the young generation can go and engage in that particular things also. But obviously the literary translation has been very so I would like to open the forum for the questions, and we have some questions in the chat box. So may I request Sarfraz Nawaz to just unmute yourself and ask your question to Professor Rahman.
Yes, please.
Sarfraz Nawaz. Could you just let us know whether you are able to unmute yourself?
Yes,
Hello.
yes. Yes.
Yes, Sarfraz.
Yeah. Good evening, sir. Actually, I joined very late because of the connectivity problem here. Sir, I wanted to know that as you mentioned in Hazaro Khwaishein Aisi, you started with Quli Qutub Shah. So I just wanted to know which among the poets that you have translated proved to be much difficult from the point of view of translation. The ghazals that you have taken for translation, who was the most difficult to translate?
Everyone, every poet was difficult to no poet. For the first surprise, I would tell you one thing first, that thinking of translating poetry itself is a very tall order. It's not easy all the time.
Yeah, of course.
Probably in Nazm you can negotiate with much more easily, but negotiating with ghazal is far more difficult. This is one statement that I would like to make. Then coming to the poets, all these poets who are classical poets are far more difficult to translate than the modern ones, because of their language and because of the huge baggage that they carry behind them. So of course the classical poets are difficult to translate because their baggage is in history, in mythology, in say the grammar of their language. I would say much more precisely. If you would look at a poet like Mir, or if you were to look at a poet like Ghalib, or even if you were to think of a poet like Musafi, or poets of the period before Ghalib, so to say. These are difficult poets to translate. If you come to the later period, then you will find probably this order is not that tall, and you are negotiate because you are close to that age. But translating ghazal and all the poets of the ghazal is difficult, of course, no doubt about it. One more thing I would like to add here, that there may be a possibility that I have left out some very important ghazals of a particular poet, which I could have probably laid my hands upon. But my way of looking at it is this, that if you pick a text which is really very important, but if you're not in a position to do it honestly and in a better fashion that you probably think that you should have done, then you should not try your hand upon. Therefore, some of those ghazals which were much more important as texts, as literary texts, so to say, for the value that they contain, so I didn't choose them. I will give you an example of Mir. Mir is a very difficult poet to translate. And the best known ghazals of Mir, I had to choose only two ghazals only. So the two ghazals I have chosen from Mir are not his best ghazals, I would say. Because laying my hands on the best of Mir was not up to me. It was very difficult for me to negotiate with that. But therefore I chose
Yes, sir.
something which I could manage. So manageability was very important for me, because laying your
Yes,
hand on
yes.
something which you can't manage and then do a bad job of it is better not doing. So one should do something which you can manage, and something which is unmanageable, one shouldn't touch upon that. Therefore, I didn't take the best of the ghazals of Ghalib and me both. But then there was a kind of a
Yes, sir.
reconciliation. There was a kind of reconciliation. So I tried to pick the best and try to do or try. Let me also share another secret. I took 10 years to do this book. Slowly and slowly I do it. One of the
It's a
major
very long time, sir.
Yes, very long time. It took 5 years to publish because the publisher slept on it. They thought that poetry will not sell, but it sold so well that they now say that.
That,
So
yes,
what?
that's why they have come out very well, sir.
So what I did that
Yes, yes.
I translated, left it, forgot about it. Then again I went back to it after a month. Then I again forgot. So revisions and revisions and revisions. Till I came to a point that I abandoned it finally. This far, as I said earlier, this far, no further. अब इससे आगे हम नहीं कर सकते. So I stopped there.
Yes,
I hope
thank you.
some
Thank you. It was.
Okay, thank you, Professor Rahman, for being so honest about this question. Now, next we have Aisha Hussain. Aisha, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Good evening, sir. First of all,
Good
thank you
evening.
so much for the enlightening lecture. It was a very interesting talk. So what I really wanted to ask was the fact that, like it has always been said that much is lost in translation, and yet we can't do without it. But as a student of literature and communication, especially, I found myself very conflicted at times, especially in context of translations of Persian and Urdu texts by Western authors and a translator. So, for instance, there's been this constant conscious erasure of Islam or any reference to Islamic mysticism from the works of Hafiz and Rumi. And especially when we talk about Hafiz, there are versions which are not his at all, and yet people know it as his work. So, how do you navigate that? Because I find myself getting really angry about it. So, like, how do you overcome that anger and that frustration? Because these are versions that are like, widely read and accepted.
Aisha, is your question relating to the authenticity of the text, whether this text belongs to this particular author or not, or something else you are trying to find out?
It's both. So, of course, the authenticity of it's not as credible, but also the fact that some versions are so different from what the author really intended to say. Like you also talked about the intent of the author. So, but those versions are still popularly accepted. So, how do you go about it?
I think I have already referred to this in a different manner when I was speaking of two. I gave you two examples. One was Omar Khayyam. Now, Omar Khayyam's text, those who know Persian and would know that the translation by Fitzgerald is far, far removed from what the original Persian text is. Because there are two different cultures involved into this. There is no doubt about Omar Khayyam's text, that is authenticated text. Hafiz texts or many texts that you have, they are authentic texts. There is no controversy. There are certain texts about which there may be controversy, whether it is his text or not his text. Like, for example, Amir Khusro's. So much that we have about Amir Khusro is all the time very, very controversial. We don't know whether it is Amir Khusro's text. And even if there are books, already published books and recognized books, questions are raised whether this is Amir Khusro or not, because it was late 13th century. And if you look at the ghazal, that very famous ghazal, so if you look at that, that is the only ghazal which passes in the name of Amir Khusro, and that is an example of Rekhta. One line is in Persian and the other line is in what you know as Urdu, so to say, because Urdu came as a name in late 18th century. So what I'm trying to say that there is a question mark sometimes against the text, whether it is this text is someone else's text or not. So in most of the cases, we know that this is a text by X, Y, or Z, but in some cases, we don't really know. So we don't have a method of identifying that whose text, because that is a different research altogether. And in this context, I gave you a very interesting example of Premchand, because determining a Premchand text is a very difficult job, because he wrote in two languages. The names of the characters are different. One story finishes at page number so, another story in Urdu or Hindi goes to 2 more pages. Then the variations in the storyline are also found. From the middle of the story, certain passages are dropped. So determining a Premchand text is extremely. So what do? So you negotiate. You take both the texts together, and then you find which is the best way to negotiate and finally reach at a conclusion. But a translator's job will be to write about this. You cannot say that this is the text. You will have to say that this is the text which I had in my hand, and this is the other text which I had in my hand from Hindi, and this from Urdu, and these are the several translations. So you will have to write. That is what I meant by supplementing. We don't know supplementing. We don't do supplementing. Supplementing is a major part of translation activity. Unless you supplement means unless you explain what is the function that this text has for me and how it came to me and how try to negotiate. So this translation job will only be partially done. So one part of your question was how to determine the text. Of course, some texts cannot be very easily, not determined easily, like Amir Khusro's text. We have other things from Makrani's, we have from him, we have these pahelis from him, we have several other songs from him. But many questions are raised, we don't really know. We have no source of identifying for sure. But there is a certain amount of a climate of opinion that has been created about Khusro, and we know this is Khusro. Now the question of translating. Now translating such a poet about that text, particular text, there are controversies. Then we have to develop a methodology. About that methodology, we will have to write. We cannot be dishonest about the process that we have followed. Therefore, we will have to write about the methodology. And unless we write about that methodology, the process or the function of a translation of a translator will not be over. We'll have to be honest with that.
Okay.
I hope I have been able to attend to some of your queries that you had.
You have, sir. Yes. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Professor Rahman. Now we have a sort of comment which is from Chitra Nair. Chitra, would you like to comment yourself?
Yes, I can see Chitra Nair here.
Yeah.
Ask her to unmute.
Yeah.
Good evening, sir. Good evening, sir. Nice listening to you.
Good evening.
Nice listening to you. Anyway, as is usual with you, it was a very enlightening talk. And you have, in fact, you took us on a tour across the poetics, politics, etc. of translation.
Thank
It was
you.
I'm really grateful to you, sir.
Much thanks. Many thanks.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chitra. Next question is from Visambhari. Visambhari, would you like to ask yourself? Can you unmute yourself and ask your question? Vishambhari Parmar, are you there? Can you unmute yourself and ask your question? Okay, Mezzaterra team, can you unmute Visambhari? Professor, can you read the chat box and her question?
Just let me see, where is the chat box? Okay.
Or should I read it?
Vishambhari Parmar says, however, sensitivity and responsibility achieved a translation runs the danger of popularizing a particular version of the meaning of the text, as you explained, and perhaps even limiting the text to the meaning that is privileged by the translator. How does one overcome that? I think it is about negotiation with meaning. If I have been able to understand what she says, I understand that meaning itself is something which is very undefined. It remains undefined all the time. There is no one fixed meaning that a text has. It may have different kinds of meanings for different sets of readers in different ages, I mean the time frame, and also in different ages that we are in. A young man, an old man, middle-aged man's meaning is very liquid, is very undefinable. You can't define it, indefinable situation. So however, sensitivity and responsibility achieved a translation runs the danger of popularizing a particular version of the meaning of the text. Now, meaning is not determined for sure. So it is the meaning that you take out of it, as you explain. And you say then perhaps even limiting the text to the meaning that is privileged by the translator. Yes. So you limit, of course, the meaning that you derive. is what you are going to transfer. And there can be a gap in the understanding of that meaning. There can definitely be a gap in the understanding of the meaning. I give you an example from Urdu Ghazal itself. There are two kinds of love in Urdu Ghazal. One is known as love for the lady, that is romantic love. And then the other is the love for God. And in both, you have sometimes the same vocabulary being used. It's known as ishq-e-haqiqi, means the real love, means for the divine. And ishq-e-majazi means for the beloved. Now, interestingly, in the Urdu Ghazal tradition, you will find that both are celebrated in the same manner. So a particular couplet or a poem may address equally well to both. So this beloved is God. Is that unseen God whom we have never seen? We don't know how. You can't touch, you can't embrace, you can't kiss that God. The other one is next to you. So that meaning is very indefinable there. You can't define that. Therefore, this idea of love in itself in Urdu Ghazal, for example, as I mentioned at one place in my talk, that the gender is a problem there. Mostly it's male gender. And when you translate that male gender, it has to be she or it has to be he, because there it is all the time he. But maybe in your translator, if you put he all the time, that the meaning will be very different in the English text. So it could be taken by the reader who doesn't know about this whole tradition of the spiritual love and as well as this romantic love, may completely misconceive the meaning. Because in Urdu, the love is two-pronged. It has two kinds of say association simultaneously. So you cannot sometimes in the Urdu Ghazal define which love is being addressed. Is it romantic love or the divine love? So it is the matter of negotiation. So what I did, therefore, I had to, in my translation, I had to use he and she, which the original poet in the Urdu never used he or she because it was neutral gender there. So this is a negotiation that the translator has to do, putting his own critical ability into it. I said in the beginning that there is no need for a translator to know the theory. He doesn't need to know the theory, but at the same time, he has to apply his mind to be able to pick one particular phrase in a certain manner to be able to communicate what he has conceived. After all, you speak what lies in your head, what you have conceived as the idea. So that is what determines the text that you have. Yes, I can see other questions coming. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Rahman. I will, because of the paucity of time, I just ask if you have other question, kindly put it up because we will be closing the questions now. And I will also regret that I will not allow you to ask your question, but because Professor can read the question and can respond to you to save some time and take more questions. Thank you.
Yes, there is one question I can see from Rachel Barry. Yeah. Professor Barry says, good evening, it's light. Says language is just one part of culture, of course. How do you translate culture to an audience otherwise important of it? Yes, translating a culture. Well, I did mention this at places, but transferring one culture or the prominent identifiers of a culture into another culture. There is a need to acclimatize the reader to that. I give the example of the romantic love and the divine love in this context. A reader will have to acclimatize himself to be able to, because there are certain myths. The process is like this, that you have an image, you have a metaphor for a beloved or for anything that you have under the sun, which you are going to do in a particular language and then a different way in a different language, in a translated language. And that metaphor transforms it into a symbol. And that symbol finally becomes a myth. Now you know the parameters, you know the ways these get identified. For example, let me give the example of rose or the rose garden. So it stands as a metaphor for the heavens, the rose garden of heavens. Now if you go to the English metaphysical poets, Herbert uses rose garden as the garden which we ultimately aspire for. We would like to reach that rose garden. Now in Rumi also there is an image of the rose garden. So there is a proximity here, but there are many places where you don't find this proximity and you have to find that proximity. So cultural negotiation is one of the major engagements of translation theory. And for that, there can be tropes that can be used. There can be methods of negotiation that can evolve from text to text. It will not be the same text all the time. Because Hafiz, if you're reading, so maybe a spiritualist meaning may not be a different kind of a meaning may come out of Hafiz. But if you use the same spiritualist physiology, it might sometimes work, but it might not work at other times. But Rumi, for example, Hafiz and Rumi are two different kinds of poets if you think of Persia. Now, if you think of Urdu, then there is a poet called Khaja Mirdad. That is a mystic poet. Or if you think of a poet like Siraj Aurangabadi, major poet, major mystic poet also. So if you think of these poets, you will have to probably enter into the target language domain to be able to find an equivalent, so that a negotiation can take place. Is there a possible way of negotiating Siraj's phraseology, Siraj's idea of the divine in the language into which I'm translating? Now, in India, this possibility is huge because we have so many languages and there are possibilities of finding one. So suppose if I'm doing from Urdu into English, so I can probably look at the whole linguistic and the cultural context of a particular language, that is English, and see how Siraj or Khaja Mirdad or Musafi they are trying to, or even for example Mir, because Mir also reaches that point of philosophical height. Many places he reaches that. So that cultural equivalence is a matter of great negotiation, and for that, the critical sensibility of the author and what is available in the target language, which can bring it closer. So the availability of the parallel cultural signifiers, the possibility of the availability of the cultural signifiers in the target language, and looking for that, I think that can be a way of negotiating with that. I think this is what she was trying to say, and I think that is what I could do probably.
Thank you, Professor. We have another last question that would be by Sejuti Chakraborty.
Okay,
so,
please read out. Jyoti, are you reading it?
No, please, sir, if you can read.
Jyoti Chakraborty.
Sejuti, that's the last question, or if you want me to read, I can read it. So Sejuti is asking.
Sejuti, yes, I can see. Yeah. Could you please read it because it's very small here? I can't.
Okay.
Please read out.
So it's saying that disinterestedness is essential in the pursuit of knowledge. To what extent is this a requirement in author's approach to translation?
Disinterestedness, if I can understand, means objectivity that you maintain. You detach yourself from the text. Probably this is what she wants to understand. Not being a kind of what Auden says, a kind of a clinical detachment that you need to develop from the object that you are trying to portray or which you're trying to represent in a literary text. So disinterestedness is essential in the pursuit of knowledge. Yes, understand. This is within quotes. To what extent is that a requirement in an author's approach to translation? Fine. Disinterested here, probably, as far as I can understand, is about talking about the clinical detachment. You are into it, and you still maintain a distance from that to be able to look at it much more, say, critically, objectively, and from a distance, not being a part of it. This takes me to Keats's negative capability, to be in the midst of adversities and yet being away from it. Or just the opposite of it, say a spontaneous overflow, but then he says, Wordsworth says a later part of it, recollected in tranquility. So you have to have maintained a difference. Until you maintain the difference, otherwise you are going to be subjective. So this is what disinterested, probably what she means, Sajuti. And then she says, to what extent is this a requirement in an author's approach to the translation? Author's approach to translation means, you mean the translator's approach to translation. The translator will have to look at the text. His source is the text, and she has to go.
May I clarify, sir, if I'm allowed to?
Yes,
please.
So what I meant is, usually in the pursuit of knowledge, be it, let's say, natural sciences, a person has to be, the researcher or scientist has to be completely unbiased, like the ideological belief, nothing should come into play. So what caught my attention was you were talking about the complex methodology of translation, how it is becoming more and more complex, if you look at it. So my question is, sir, how can the author be completely unbiased, like your belief system and everything as an author? To what extent you can probably keep them away?
So, are you talking of the writer who is writing a text in the first language, that is the creative writer in a language, and are you talking of the translator?
Sir, translator.
The translator doesn't have a business into it, because the translator has to be honest to the text that has come to his hand. He does not need to interrogate it. why did you take this particular point of view about certain maybe political ideology that the first writer is talking about. The translator has to reflect that only. He doesn't need to interrogate why this particular political ideology he has written about. So he has only to follow the text that is in hand, that he is trying to engage with. Now, that is why in the beginning I said there is a politics in translation. The why you choose a particular text, why you choose a particular author, a particular age, a particular genre, this is a matter of choice. A politics is about that. So whatever comes to the hand of the translator is his basic material. He cannot indulge into it by making any kind of revisions and agreeing or disagreeing. So there is a huge danger in, for example, indulging or trying to negotiate with the text according to one's own choice. The matter of sciences is different. Similarly, in literature also, you cannot make any revisions in the original idea that has been put forward by an author, and the translator has no right probably to say revise or to make changes or to bring in something new or to interpolate or to change the text, because then the text will lose its force, entirely lose its force. There is, I mean, the resurrectionative force, the reason that is lying behind the text. I mean that. I hope I've been able to, I don't know how far.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Rahman. I think we have come to the conclusion because the time we have is 6:30. On behalf of Christ University, Bannerghatta Road campus, we would like to thank you for your time and passionately engaging with the questions from the audience. I would also like to thank the audience for being patient and listening to the talk and putting your question to enrich the discussion and truly making this sense of Mezzaterra on this translation day. I think translation can be considered the true place of Mezzaterra, where you bring two culture, two language together and then melt it to get some kind of cream out of it. So thank you, Professor Anisur Rahman. We would be looking forward to have more interaction with you in future. With this, we will conclude this session for today till we meet again. I remain. Thank you.
Thank you, Santosh Kumar ji. Thanks everyone at that end. You are very close to my heart. I can see you all, and I can see many of friends who we have interacted earlier also. It has been a pleasure being a part of this Mezzaterra conversation and a part of Christ activities, because when I was in Christ University, I really greatly enjoyed being there, as I am enjoying this moment. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to be able to connect with you all. So I'm really happy, and I express my gratitude. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, sir. You're welcome.
Thank you so much, sir, for joining us, and thank you for this wonderful talk to us too.
Great.